Have you ever wondered why some women stop explaining, stop defending, stop pleading, and simply walk away in silence? It is not indifference that drives them, but a quiet power born from the ashes of their own awakening, the kind of power that no longer seeks to be understood, because understanding from others was once the very chain that kept them bound. Once they believed that love meant effort, that if they just explained themselves more clearly, gave more compassion, showed more patience, the world would mirror their goodness. But reality, in its brutal honesty, has a way of stripping illusions. They began to see that not all listening is understanding, not all arguing is connection. There comes a moment when the psyche, tired of the same circular battles, decides to preserve its energy, rather than defend its worth. Carl Jung once wrote that what you resist persists. And for many women, the resistance was endless, resisting dismissal, misunderstanding, betrayal, invisibility. They tried to fight for fairness, for recognition, for emotional reciprocity. Yet every argument became an echo chamber of unmet needs. It wasn't until they stopped engaging that they finally began to see. In Jungian terms, the woman who argues endlessly is often caught in the dance between her ego and her shadow. Her ego says, if I can make him understand, I'll be safe. Her shadow whispers, you don't believe you're enough without his validation. And between those two inner voices, her energy drains into the abyss of trying to be seen. But when she detaches, not from love, but from illusion, something extraordinary happens. The animus, the inner masculine principle that once sought approval from the outer masculine world, turns inward, becomes a sword of discernment rather than a weapon of defense. She no longer uses her voice to prove her value. She uses her silence to preserve her dignity. You may have seen her before, a woman standing in quiet defiance while chaos brews around her. She doesn't shout, doesn't threaten, doesn't plead. She just gathers her things, sometimes literally, sometimes emotionally, and leaves. That departure is not an escape, but an act of individuation. The process Jung described as becoming one's true self beyond social masks and projections. To leave, in this sense, is not to run away. It is to reclaim sovereignty over one's inner world. The moment she steps away from argument, she steps into self-mastery. Because what she has learned is that you cannot awaken someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. This act of detachment is not coldness. It's compassion for herself. It's the realization that staying in cycles of misunderstanding is a form of self-abandonment. And self-abandonment is the quiet death of the soul. Jung warned that what we do not make conscious controls us. A woman who stays in arguments that erode her peace has not yet seen the unconscious wound driving her need to be right, or to be loved through being right. But the strong woman, the detached one, has seen it. She's walked through the fire of disappointment and found her center. She understands now that detachment is not a wall, but a boundary. It says, I will no longer fight for what should flow. When she leaves, the world around her often reacts. Those who once dismissed her suddenly feel the weight of her absence. Her silence becomes a mirror that reflects back their own noise. And perhaps in that moment, they realize that the most powerful statement she ever made was not in words, but in withdrawal. There is a sacred stillness that comes when the mind stops needing to prove, when the heart stops begging to be chosen, when the soul stops fighting to be seen. That stillness is not emptiness, it is clarity. And clarity, in Jungian language, is the sign that the self, the divine center of the psyche, has taken its rightful place within. So if you have ever found yourself exhausted from trying to be heard, remember this, silence can be louder than argument. Leaving can be more healing than convincing, and detachment, when rooted in self-awareness, is not avoidance, it is transcendence. Because sometimes the most loving thing a woman can do is walk away, not to punish, not to prove, but to return to herself. Detachment, when it blooms, is not born in peace but in chaos. It is not something a woman decides on a calm afternoon. It is forged in the furnace of countless emotional battles. At first she mistakes silence for weakness, leaving for failure. But over time, the psyche begins to whisper. There is nothing more to say. This whisper grows louder each time she realizes her words have fallen on ears tuned only to respond, not to understand. In those moments, Her unconscious begins its rebellion against the cycle of futility. Jung believed that the unconscious always seeks wholeness, and wholeness often requires breaking away from patterns that fracture the self, even if that means walking away from what once felt like home. The power of detachment is, therefore, not an act of pride but of individuation. To detach is to separate from the collective illusions of what love should be, and to meet life as it is, not as fantasy, not as expectation. Most women are taught that love means endurance, compromise, understanding. Few are taught that love without self-respect is self-erasure. In Jungian terms, detachment marks the moment when the ego loosens its grip on the external and begins to align with the deeper self. The ego wants to be right. The self wants to be whole. The ego argues for dominance. The self seeks understanding. The ego clings to relationships that validate its identity. The self allows them to dissolve when they no longer nourish its evolution. There is something sacred in that dissolution. Feels at first like grief, a private death. For every woman who has ever left a place where her voice was dismissed, her leaving is not simply walking away from another, but walking toward her own wholeness. It is shedding an identity that once believed love could be earned through endurance. You may not notice this transformation from the outside. To others, she might seem colder, more withdrawn, perhaps even distant. But internally, something magnificent is taking shape, the birth of emotional sovereignty. She is no longer seeking permission to exist in peace. Her worth is no longer dependent on reconciliation or approval. The wound that once demanded explanation has become the teacher that teaches silence. Marcus Aurelius once said, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." But the wise woman takes it further. The best response is no reaction at all, because reaction ties you to the energy of the other. Detachment frees you from it. When she no longer reacts, she is not suppressing emotion. She has simply mastered it. Yet this mastery is not numbness. It is paradoxically deeper feeling without being enslaved by it. A detached woman feels everything but does not allow feeling to dictate her worth or her direction. Jung might say she has integrated her shadow. The parts of her that once feared abandonment or rejection no longer rule her. She sees them, honors them, but does not obey them. Think of it as the alchemy of the soul. In ancient alchemy, lead transforms into gold not through destruction but through refinement. Detachment is that refinement. The woman who once reacted to every slight now pauses and asks herself, what part of me seeks to control this? What am I afraid of losing if I stop explaining? And in that pause, she transforms. It is not easy. The human psyche craves connection. Jung called it the collective unconscious, the invisible web of archetypes that ties us all together. The lover within her wants to stay. The caregiver wants to heal. But the warrior, the sage, the self, they call her onward. They whisper that love cannot thrive in the soil of constant conflict. To leave is not to abandon love. It is to honor it enough to stop distorting it through endless battle. When she walks away, she takes with her the lesson. Love is not proven by endurance, but by alignment. If the connection requires her to betray her peace, it is not love. It is attachment. And so she learns that real detachment is not about shutting people out. It is about allowing what is false to fall away. What remains after that is truth. Raw, simple, liberating truth. The world may misinterpret her silence. Some may call her heartless, arrogant, too proud. But Jung reminds us that the most dangerous thing is to live by the projections of others. A strong woman who leaves is not rejecting others. She is rejecting the roles they project onto her. The savior, the fixer, the pleaser. In letting go of those masks, she steps closer to her essence. Her detachment is not escape. It is evolution. She is not running from love. She is walking toward self-realization. There is a moment in every strong woman's journey when she realizes that not every battle is meant to be fought. Some are meant to be witnessed, understood, and then released. This realization often arrives quietly, after years of trying to make the world mirror her heart. She learns that people rarely meet you as you are. They meet you as they are, and no amount of explanation can reach someone determined to misunderstand. That is when she stops arguing. To those still caught in the patterns of emotional survival, her silence looks like surrender. But silence is rarely submission. it is strategy. In Jungian terms, the woman who detaches has shifted from the realm of the ego to the realm of the self. She is no longer fighting external shadows because she has begun to integrate her own. For most of her life, she lived within projection. Every argument was not just about the other person. It was about her inner archetypes battling for dominance. The wounded child who longed to be seen clashed with the protector who demanded respect. The lover wanted harmony. The warrior wanted freedom. And the endless inner dialogue spilled into the outer world, manifesting as conflicts, debates, tears, and exhaustion. But as Jung taught, until you make the unconscious conscious, will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The woman who leaves has seen her own unconscious in full light. She knows now that her compulsion to argue was not about convincing others. It was about convincing herself that her worth depended on being understood. Once she no longer believes that, her silence becomes her sanctuary. She now understands what the Stoics meant when they said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. The true battlefield is not in the world but within." The outer argument dissolves when the inner one ends. Her detachment, then, is not apathy. It is the highest form of empathy, for herself and for the human condition. She recognizes that every person she once fought with was, in truth, fighting their own unseen battle. Every harsh word they spoke came from an unhealed wound. Every dismissal was a projection of their own fear. And while she can understand this, she no longer feels compelled to fix it. Understanding no longer requires participation. This is the turning point, where emotional maturity meets spiritual clarity. She can witness the storm without being pulled into it. She knows that to argue with someone trapped in their defenses is to argue with a wall and call it love. True connection does not demand proof. It demands presence. You might feel that same pull to justify yourself, to explain, to prove your innocence in the face of misunderstanding. But pause for a moment. What would happen if you didn't? What if instead of explaining, you simply observed? What if instead of defending, you detached with dignity? Would the world fall apart? Or would your peace finally return? In that stillness, something profound unfolds. The psyche reorganizes itself. The nervous system, once trapped in the rhythm of reactivity, begins to breathe again. Silence, once terrifying, becomes medicine. She discovers the sacred space between reaction and response, the birthplace of power. When she walks away now, it is not out of anger but awareness. She no longer sees departure as failure but as fulfillment. She has completed the cycle of trying to control what was never hers to control. Perception, approval, emotional reciprocity. She now understands that control is the illusion that keeps love captive. Detachment breaks that spell. Jung's process of individuation is precisely this journey, moving from unconscious identification with others to conscious unity with the self. A strong woman who leaves is not becoming isolated. She is becoming integrated. Her solitude is not loneliness, it is alignment. She may still feel grief. Every ending carries the echo of loss. But grief in this context is purification. It washes away dependency, fear, and the illusion that peace can be negotiated. When the tears finally dry, what remains is a deeper knowing, a quiet certainty that no external chaos can touch her inner stillness again. This is not the woman who slams doors or writes long messages begging to be understood. This is the woman who smiles faintly, says, "I wish you peace," and steps into the unknown with grace. Her detachment is her prayer, her silence, her declaration of sovereignty. And as she walks away, she doesn't just leave a person or a situation behind. She leaves behind a version of herself, the one who needed to be chosen, the one who needed to win, the one who believed love must hurt to be real. In her absence, she becomes more present than ever before. Because true strength is not in holding on. It is in knowing when to let go without resentment, without bitterness, without hate. Just the quiet recognition that not every soul is meant to walk beside you. Some are meant to wake you up, break you open, and then fade into the distance so that you can finally meet yourself. There comes a sacred moment, subtle, almost imperceptible, when a woman who once sought to be understood no longer needs to be. It is not because she has given up, but because she has awakened. She realizes that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the refusal to participate in one's own diminishment. Her silence now is not emptiness but elegance. Her detachment is not avoidance but awareness. In Jungian psychology, this state represents a profound shift from identification with the persona, the mask she once wore to please, to appease, to be accepted, to alignment with the self, the divine core of her being. The persona sought harmony at any cost, even the cost of authenticity. But the self seeks truth, even when that truth demands solitude. And solitude is precisely where she now stands, not lonely, but luminous. In her stillness, she no longer reacts to the projections of others. Jung wrote that we meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life. Every person she argued with, every man she tried to convince, was a mirror of her own unconscious need to be validated. But when she leaves, she is finally ready to stop looking outward for reflection and turn inward toward recognition. This turning inward is not a retreat from the world. It is a return to the center. The woman who detaches learns to sit with herself. She becomes intimate with her own company. She learns to hear her thoughts without judgment, to feel her emotions without drowning in them. Her solitude becomes a temple, not a prison. The walls once built to protect her are now gates that open to her freedom. From this stillness arises clarity, the kind that cannot be taught, only lived. She begins to notice how energy speaks louder than words, how peace feels more powerful than persuasion. She sees how those who truly care will never require her to explain her worth, and those who don't will never understand no matter how much she explains. The futility of argument becomes the wisdom of surrender. You may recognize this within yourself, too. The moment when arguing feels like betraying your own calm, when silence feels like power, and detachment feels like truth. It's not that you've become indifferent. It's that you've evolved beyond the need for validation. You no longer need someone to agree with your truth for it to be real. That is the mark of emotional maturity, the end of dependency on outer affirmation. And yet, this transformation is not easy. The psyche resists it. There will be moments when the old self calls out, "Say something. Defend yourself. Don't let them win." But victory, she now understands, was never about winning over others. It was about winning back herself. The battle was never external. It was always within. In this way, detachment becomes her spiritual armor. Not the cold armor of avoidance, but the luminous shield of discernment. She no longer engages with those who weaponize misunderstanding. She knows that not every question deserves an answer. Not every accusation deserves defense, and not every silence deserves to be broken. The Stoics understood this state well. Seneca wrote, "He who is brave is free." And bravery for a strong woman is not the courage to fight, but the courage to walk away. To trust that what she leaves behind will no longer define her, and what awaits her ahead is a more truthful life. In her detachment, she begins to see that relationships, romantic, familial, or otherwise, are not measures of worth but mirrors of evolution. Some connections exist only to awaken dormant parts of her soul. Once that awakening happens, to cling to them is to resist growth. She lets go, therefore, not because she doesn't care, but because she finally does, about her peace, her alignment, her becoming. As the days unfold, her energy changes. She radiates something others can feel but cannot name, a quiet strength, a serene intensity. She no longer needs to prove her worth through words. Her presence says enough. Her silence becomes a lesson. Her leaving, an initiation. Those who once underestimated her will notice the shift. Some will try to pull her back into old patterns. Others will simply fade away, unable to reach her frequency. And yet she holds no resentment. Jung taught that the greatest burden a soul must bear is the unlived life. She no longer carries the burden of unlived authenticity. Her detachment frees her to live fully, without compromise. She is no longer defined by who hurt her, who failed to understand her, or who tried to silence her. She is defined by the vastness of her stillness, by the peace that no longer depends on external conditions. One day, she looks back at all the times she argued, pleaded, and begged to be seen, and she smiles, not with regret but with gratitude. Those moments were the necessary trials that forged her detachment. They were the crucible that turned her pain into perception, her longing into liberation. For a strong woman, leaving was never about escape. It was about elevation. She left not because she stopped caring, but because she started caring in a higher way. She no longer fights for connection. She stands in truth and lets connection meet her there. And that is the secret of detachment. It does not kill love. It refines it. What remains after detachment is not bitterness but clarity. A love so pure it no longer clings. Freedom, when it arrives, does not come with fanfare. It comes quietly, often in the early morning hours when the mind, for once, is still. The strong woman awakens and feels something she cannot name, an absence of weight, the absence of needing to be chosen, understood, or proven right. It is the soft hum of peace after years of inner noise. She walks through her day differently now. Not with arrogance, but with awareness. She observes rather than reacts, listens rather than defends. She feels energy before she hears words, and when she senses conflict rising around her, she no longer feels compelled to step into it. She understands that arguments, for many, are not about truth, but about control. To detach, then, is to refuse the invitation to re-enter the battlefield of egos. In Jungian psychology, this marks a pivotal moment of individuation, the integration of the opposites within the psyche. Where she once swung between overgiving and resentment, she now rests in balance. Her feminine softness no longer fears her masculine discernment. Her inner animus has matured. He no longer manifests as defensiveness or aggression, but as inner stability, clarity, and boundaries. She has become whole. To the untrained eye, she may appear detached, aloof even. But beneath that serenity is an ocean of understanding. She has seen the shadow of herself and of others, and she no longer fears either. She recognizes projection when she encounters it. When someone blames her for their own insecurity, when a partner accuses her of what they themselves suppress. She doesn't absorb those projections anymore. They slide off her energy field like rain from glass. Jung said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But once the lesson is learned, irritation dissolves. What remains is compassion, quiet, unassuming compassion. She can see the wounded inner child behind someone's cruelty. She can feel the fear beneath their arrogance. Yet she does not stay to fix it. Healing is an invitation, not an obligation. And so her leaving is not an act of anger, but of love. Love that has matured beyond dependency. She no longer confuses compassion with self-sacrifice. Her boundaries are not walls. They are expressions of self-respect. To detach for her is not to stop feeling, but to stop betraying herself in the name of feeling. You, too, may know this transition. The moment when you no longer chase closure. When you stop needing to explain your perspective to those committed to misunderstanding it. The ego resists this surrender because it equates silence with defeat. But the self knows that silence is transcendence. The more evolved the soul, the less it argues with noise. In the modern world, detachment often carries a cold connotation, as if to detach means to stop caring. But in Jung's view, detachment is a natural outcome of individuation. It is the stage where consciousness expands beyond dualities, right and wrong, victim and villain, win and lose. The woman who has reached this point does not live by polarity anymore. She lives by presence. There's beauty in that simplicity. She can love someone deeply and still walk away. She can understand another's pain and still protect her peace. She can hold tenderness in one hand and boundaries in the other, and call that balance. This is not coldness. It is sacred maturity. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Choose not to be harmed and you won't be." She finally understands what he meant. Harm begins where self-abandonment begins. The moment she refuses to leave her peace for someone else's chaos, she becomes untouchable. Not because she is unreachable, but because she is aligned. Her detachment is now a form of faith. Faith that what is meant for her will meet her without struggle. Faith that love does not require persuasion. Faith that life unfolds not through force, but through flow. The arguments once so consuming now feel small, like echoes from another lifetime. In this spaciousness, she discovers something she had forgotten in the noise: joy. Not the fleeting joy of validation, but the grounded joy of existence. She feels it in the morning sun, in her breath, in her solitude. It is the joy of simply being, the joy of not needing the world to mirror her worth back to her. And this is how transformation completes its circle. The woman who once argued to be heard now listens to silence. The woman who once begged to be seen now sees herself clearly. The woman who once stayed to prove her love now leaves to preserve it. As she moves through life, she no longer fears endings. They are simply thresholds to deeper authenticity. Her detachment is her compass, guiding her toward relationships that resonate, not drain. She doesn't chase. She attracts. She doesn't demand. She aligns. In the end, she understands the profound paradox of detachment. By letting go, she gains everything. She gains herself, and when she finally smiles, not for anyone, not to prove anything, but simply because she is free. That is the true power of detachment, the power of walking away not in bitterness, but in grace. Not in defeat, but in awakening, not because she stopped caring, but because she finally started caring for herself. Thank you for spending this time with us. Your journey gives life to this channel. Stay with us, and together we'll keep exploring, growing, and discovering the truths that shape the soul. Till the next video, take care and see you soon.